As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we have two new members. We've heard from three of our keynote speakers, but I'm going to actually invite our two panelists whom we haven't heard from already to open up this discussion. So Katri, I'll start with you. You, of course, bring the perspective from Finland. I think it's fair to say you're a rising star in Finnish politics, and you've heard some very interesting analysis of where the sort of geopolitics of the Arctic region sits right now in terms of the perspectives from some of the key players in this region. So talking from the point of view of Finland, one of the key Arctic European nations, do you feel right now that the geopolitics of the region is in a difficult and perhaps potentially dangerous place, i.e. that the whole spirit of cooperation in the Arctic is in some ways under threat?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introductory, Stephen. I might say that, of course, there are always some tensions, unfortunately, but still Arctic nations has managed to do extremely well and close cooperation. And in the end, as Minister of Foreign Affairs said, that Tromsø has been her hometown. I'm actually only a few hundred miles away from here, from the bordering Finland. So it is our home region, and of course we're working for it.
Do you mean to say that whatever tensions there may be, and we'll discuss them between, for example, Washington and Moscow or Washington and Beijing, that when it comes to the specific issues, concerns and interests of the Arctic, those huge geopolitical issues are put to one side? Is that the sense you have?
Well, I hope that in the core of the Arctic cooperation are the things that we see here behind us on the scene. It's the living area for the indigenous people, for us, for the locals. We're worried about the global change and how it affects the living, the livelihoods here. And of course, we're very interested to see the future. How can we do the transition to get rid of fossil fuels, and how we can change the things to be the smart Arctic region and territory. And if we can do it here in the harsh climate conditions, no doubt that the other regions of the world can do it likewise.
Well, we'd love to believe the Arctic can be a leader, an example, a model, if you like, of cooperation. But Stephanie, I want to bring you in, because I know at RAND you spend a lot of time looking at Russia and Russia's relations with the other big powers, in particular China and the United States. Obviously, in a way, the sort of mini elephant in our classroom is that the Russians are not here on the stage, but you at least are in a great position to analyze what Russia is bringing in terms of its policy positions, its strategic overview of the Arctic right now. So how would you characterize it?
Well, I would, coming back on your first question, actually, I would want to emphasize the degree of cooperation that still exists, at least at the working level. That is very different from the diplomatic tensions that you can see. So, for instance, there was a recent joint Russian-US proposal to the IMO for safer shipping lanes in the Bering Strait, which represent a considerable improvement in terms of avoiding, reducing risk of collision and ensuring safer navigation in the strait. And this is not to have too much of a rosy view. Obviously, there are some very serious challenges, but I think it's also very important to sometimes set aside the more sort of dramatic discourse on tensions around the Arctic and look also at what is actually happening and how cooperation is still making progress. Obviously, this is a small part. Russia is not here today, well, at least on this panel.
I mean, there are Russians here today, but,
yes,
but yeah, not on this particular
panel. Not on
panel.
this particular panel, and there are some forums that have not been working anymore since 2014, such as the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which was a useful forum.
Why was that halted?
Oh, because of the Crimea.
The post-Crimea, it was part of the whole sort of sanctions.
Yes,
yeah.
It was part of just the ending of like high-level relations on military issues were suspended.
Yeah.
And that was one of the forums where that took place. Also, the Chief of Defense Forum experienced the same fate. But that being said, everything that's not strictly military, like the Arctic Council, obviously, and other forums are still functioning, and some level of cooperation is still going on.
I suppose, if I may bring you in, Senator Murkowski, I suppose the issue is the degree to which, for example, the multilateral, the Arctic Council approach really matters right now, because we live in a world where, and it has to be said, your own President Donald Trump is in the vanguard of this. There are leaders around the world who seem much less interested in going down the multilateral route than exercising national power and seeing the world framing it in terms of national interests. Does that concern you?
Well, it does, and again, you bring in the role that the Arctic Council can play in helping to bring about the level of collaboration, cooperation, and really take us out of this more nationalistic approach. I recall when the Arctic Council was hosted by Sweden, we were in Kiruna, and I cannot remember for the life of me what the international incident was going on between the United States and Russia, but it was very tense and it was very difficult. And Lavrov and Secretary Kerry at the time were not talking on most things, but they stood there and together signed, I believe it was the oil spill prevention cooperative, or the agreement at that moment. And it was just a very direct reminder that when everything else is challenging between two nations, there are areas that we can come together on. My hope is that this can continue to be one. But when you think back to what I just stated at the beginning, that in my view, under this administration, we are not assigning significant priority to our role as an Arctic nation. It does cause me to wonder how we're going to do that at the highest level.
Well, I think you were very frank with us. I think at one point you talked about a void.
There is a void.
A void. I mean, Foreign Minister, you and I know we've talked about this before, you tend toward the optimistic that somehow the Arctic can bring people together even if they're miles apart elsewhere. But if they're, this isn't just about tensions between Russia and Moscow. Between Russia and the United States. It's also about whether the United States cares much anymore, particularly from the very top, from the White House down. What if it doesn't? What if this void continues?
Well, I think you have to look at this in two different ways, because on the one hand, as I've pointed out, I have a tendency of turning the map upside down, and it's just to show people that geostrategically this region has increased significance, and also in a way militarily, and that is also because Russia is now increasing their military presence. They are reopening old bases, and we see that their bastion defense concept is once again reinvigorated, and we all know what that entails.
That's a negative, right?
Yeah, but that still doesn't mean that we perceive Russia as a military threat or things directed towards Norway. But in that framework, we see that despite what you can read out of Twitter feeds and other things, there is an increased engagement from the US when it comes to European security, with more investments. We had a very good cooperation with the US in NATO before this summit last summer, where we managed to do what is a piece of artwork, I would say, for anyone who have been trying to do this. We changed the command structure of NATO. That is almost impossible. And we also highlighted focus on a new maritime posture, which is extremely important, namely in this region, the North Atlantic. So I think you have to view it from two different angles.
Well, yes, but you read the US newspapers as well as I do, and you've seen in the last week authoritative reporting suggesting that Donald Trump over the past year has repeatedly said to aides that unless things change very quickly, he is minded to take the United States out of NATO. I mean, that is the context in which we here in the Arctic are talking about big plow politics, that things have changed fundamentally in Washington.
Well, to a certain extent they have, but what we see in the bilateral relationship, for instance, is, if anything, increased and strengthened. And that is also very much due to politicians like Lisa and others who put this on the forefront on a daily basis, that we have to work together with close friends and allies, because that is also serving the US interests. But let me just pick up one point you made on the Arctic Council, which I think is in this context also quite interesting. I think one of the keys to the success of the Arctic Council and the way we have managed to cooperate, even in, I would say, chillier times, is the fact that some areas are not part of the discussions of the Arctic Council. We do not do hard security policy in the Arctic Council. I think that is a good thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have been able to keep it this way and to keep the cooperation going on, I would say, a number of issues that are highly relevant to our region, but that doesn't necessarily hamper that cooperation because we're discussing the same issues that we could be discussing in other forums as well.
Thank you for that. I don't just want to focus this on Russia and its current strategic position in the Arctic. I want to talk about China too, although I have just been handed a note. This is quite important because we don't want to give the wrong impression. Everybody connected with the Arctic frontiers just wants it to be clear that Russia has been invited here on the political level, but unfortunately in terms of political representation, they were not able to send delegates. So they were invited to take part in this sort of political discussion, but they are not here. But Gunson, you are very much analyzing the China role, and I'm intrigued because I'm an international journalist and I spend a lot of time traveling the world, and there are many, many parts of the world where China, because of its ability to invest quickly and invest big in parts of the world where they haven't had a presence but want to establish a strategic presence, they are making a real difference. One can look at many different parts of Africa where this is true. But let's shift focus and move north to the Arctic. Is China trying to use that ability to invest and to sort of work with local people to develop projects? Is it using it to establish a new foothold in the Arctic? And is it a very conscious strategic decision?
Well, China has a pattern of believing that money talks. So especially in developing countries or less developed countries, the Chinese financing has been very useful in opening doors, expanding influence, building projects, then buying more influence locally. But in the Arctic, I think that approach has encountered some obstacles because countries in the Arctic are not as in desperate need as in some African countries for Chinese financing. So the bargaining position is much better for the Arctic states. And also applauding Arctic Council and countries in the Arctic, you have been safeguarding, for example, the environmental impact of the projects in this region. So Chinese projects and Chinese proposals of projects have been watched very closely in terms of their environmental and social impact, and questions have been asked. And I think the Chinese are very well aware of this. So on the other hand, I think the Chinese has also identified Russia as an entry point because Russia is in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis China in this bilateral negotiation about the Arctic. So in the Russia case, we see more interesting discussion there.
You mean because China sees opportunities to work with the Russians because the Russians have been closed out of much international finance and business because of sanctions? Is that a weakness that the Russians have, which means that they are more inclined to work with China? Is that sort of what you're suggesting?
Because Russia does not have as many options. In terms of the international financiers and the international investment, China has pretty much been left with as the only one who has a capacity. But where's the willingness? So what the Chinese have identified is that Russia have been reaching out to China, try to entice China into more investment, for example, along the Northern Sea route. But when the Chinese do their calculation as for the economic practicality and the feasibility of the Northern Sea route, as well as a limited concession and compromise Russia is willing to put on the table in order to make the Chinese deal worthwhile for Beijing. That's why I argue that we do not see as much development along the Northern Sea route as people otherwise would like to believe.
I mean, we are very much talking about strategic positioning here of big powers, but some of the biggest issues that matter most to people in the Arctic, and then frankly to the whole world as well because of the environmental connectivity, those issues would be, for example, climate change and the degree to which the Arctic is at the center of the debate about what is happening to our climate and how we best respond to it, but also the issues surrounding indigenous peoples and getting justice and making sure that indigenous peoples are at the very center of an agenda for future development in this region. Those are perhaps, I was going to say softer power issues, but I mean they're hugely important, but they're not necessarily at the front of people's thinking in Washington DC and Moscow right now. So how do you ensure, Minister, because I know you care about them, how do you ensure that they remain very much at the center of an Arctic agenda?
Well, I think it's a very important point, and what I've seen over the years is that both the topics that you mentioned, both the climate change issue and also indigenous peoples, is something that also constitutes more or less the foundation of many of the corporations that we have in the Arctic. Funnily enough, climate change issues is the center of much of the research that we're doing. I mean, we have 11 research facilities for 10 countries in a small place in Svalbard, in Ny-Ålesund. And we all have to cooperate. So that has really been one of the, I think, very interesting things to see when you know that climate change is happening twice as fast in the Arctic as anywhere else, and you can easily see and feel the consequences, even though they do not come from the Arctic, they are felt there very quickly. And that has generated more cooperation.
But don't you find it deeply dispiriting? Even today, we've all woken up to see Donald Trump's latest tweet saying it's snowing in many parts of the United States, and people who advocate global warming should sort of just frankly...
He did use the word.
Yes, he did use the word, but only really to mock him.
I know.
I'm not. I mean, I don't relate to his Twitter feed at all. Partly because I'm not on Twitter, which sometimes can be a blessing. But secondly, because what we have done when it comes to climate change, ever since the U.S. said that it would pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, we have intensified our cooperation with U.S. states, which do have a very, I would say, bold climate agenda in many aspects. That has been a way to continue our cooperation and collaboration with the US on these areas.
Yes, I mean, I can see that, but nonetheless, it is, in strategic terms, a fundamental problem, is it not? That you can't deny that when you are so committed to addressing the climate change challenge, you have a president in the United States who, frankly, is fundamentally disagreeing with your objectives and your mindset, your worldview.
But I think that we cannot only make this a discussion about Trump, because it is...
I don't want to make it a discussion about Trump,
but
ultimately Trump matters to what the United States does.
He does, obviously. I mean, otherwise he wouldn't be president, and otherwise the presidential powers would be quite limited. So that is obvious. But what I'm saying is that many of the developments that we have seen started also before the Trump administration. American policies started to shift at some point. We have seen that despite what is the daily updates on Twitter, the cooperation on, I would say, key vital issues for Norway, for Europe, has not changed. There is a remarkable, I would say, amount of continuity in much of the security policy, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think that part of the reason is that we have centers like Lisa, we have representatives in Congress, we have politicians who really uphold that kind of thought on the alliance as well.
Minister,
you're
Minister's investing huge hope in you,
now.
Senator Murkowski, and are you able to assure her that whatever's happening in the White House, it can be dealt with, and that the United States' strategic sort of commitment to joining most of the rest of the world in the battle against climate change is going to be fulfilled?
I think it's important for folks to realize that as much as the attention has been focused on the president and some of his words, that yes, he is president, but we do have three separate but equal branches of government. I think this is exactly the time that the role of the Congress needs to be accelerated, amped up. The level of response and responsibility that we have is key, and it is critical. I mentioned very briefly the legislation that we're doing to ensure that the indigenous peoples have a role at the table when it comes to policy setting. as there has been an effort by the executive to scrub the word climate change from statements and titles, that doesn't mean it eliminates or it removes the work that is being done to address our emissions, to do more when it comes to efficiencies, to do more when it comes to building out our technologies that allow for, whether it's our renewables or our alternative fuels, so that we are being responsive global citizens. So there is very clearly a considerable tension, but I think it is important to recognize that even though you have many who will not want to engage in this discussion, there's a growing reality that we all have that responsibility. I was at a conference a couple days ago. A general from head of the Alaska Command said, look, when it comes to climate change, I'm not going to get involved in that debate. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a geographer. But he says, but I am a master of the obvious. That kind of sums it right up. So it's obvious, it's there, we have a responsibility, let's act. And we all have that responsibility to do it at the level at which we serve. And so my role, certainly as a senator from Alaska that comes from a producing state, but also from a state that is seeing the impact of climate change more dramatically than anywhere else in the United States, I feel that I have a responsibility to advance that balance.
I'm going to open it up in just a second, but Stephanie, I just want to ask you, as you do study Russia a great deal, what is the mindset in Moscow when it comes to climate change issues and Russia's strategic commitment to doing, its bit when it comes to fulfilling the international sort of ambition of keeping temperatures below that 2 degree, but even 1.5 degree rise?
I could not directly speak to Moscow's mindset, but that would certainly be part of the role that Russia sees itself as playing on the international stage, as being involved in international forum and being a key player on the diplomatic stage.
And yet, well, aren't I right in saying that when it came to that recent climate meeting in Katowice in Poland, Russia joined the United States and I believe Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in opposing wording which welcomed the latest IPC report, which was very depressing, frankly, about the degree to which more needed to be done to keep temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees. The Russians didn't seem to be on the right side of what most of us would regard as the right side of the argument in that meeting.
And I think, as been underlined, it's also important to keep looking at how policy is developing at other levels, at not necessarily the highest level, but how policies that have been put into place before are continuing to unfold. For the United States, for instance, the fact that maybe the Arctic is not a priority of the president also means that gives more space to other elements of the government, like the legislative branch, or agencies who've been involved in Arctic issues forever, like the Coast Guard. They continue sort of business as usual, far from the Twitter feeds and sort of daily preoccupations that raise everybody's blood pressure, sometimes unnecessarily. And I think that similarly with NATO, what we've seen is also, as the minister underlined, a sort of greater commitment on the ground of the United States. Its participation in Trident Juncture last October, November, for instance, was very significant. There's more involvement in Norway, and that's completely dissociated from what you hear about maybe pulling out of NATO. So that's really underlining the complexity of governing and how the president could completely change everything from one day to the next, but until he does.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating what
not.
you're all saying. You're all, in your different ways, as politicians, academic analysts, you're all sort of suggesting to me, don't get too obsessed with what's happening on the surface. Look deep down below, and things aren't quite as you might think. It's a fascinating analysis, and in many ways, I and maybe members of the audience might be tempted to hope you're right. But let us see, by taking, if we can, some thoughts or questions from our audience. We've got diplomats here, we've got business leaders, we've got academics of many descriptions. So I suspect we'll have some very thoughtful questions from our audience, and I do want to just make time for a few of them right now. So you, sir, you had your hand up. Let's get a mic. Where are our roving microphones? Can we get the team of microphone rovers fully deployed? I can see people running around, but they're not running in the right direction. This gentleman here, roving microphone people, where are you? There's a gentleman here at the front who is primed and ready to speak. So hold your thoughts, sir. Don't forget what you're about to say. There we go.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. It is not because Russia prefers to have the last word, but at least we want to be heard. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, and also on behalf of the Minister of Natural Resources and Environment of Russia, to explain that there was the invitation. He could not come personally, but he sent huge delegation consisting of the Ambassador of Russia to Norway, Excellency Ramishvili, Ambassador of Russia to Arctic Council, Nikolai Korchinov, directors of the department, Sergei Khrushchev, myself, from Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and businesses. It means that Russia is here.
It's important to say that. Thank you.
And we are always telling that Arctic is not the apartment hotel where you can change the rooms. We're here to stay. And that's why, of course, we are supporting the peaceful cooperation in the Arctic. That's why, just following the Arctic frontiers, we're arranging the next fora in Russia, which is called Arctic Territory of Dialogue. It means that despite all the geopolitical problems, we are intending to support the cooperation in this region. That's why it is the cooperation which is intended to strengthen the Arctic Council as the key mechanism of cooperation in its working and experts group, because we see the necessity to have such a fora which will be uniting the intentions of the Arctic Council to work out the rules of the game, setting up the new agreements, etc. And of course, at the same time, developing the bilateral relations that Her Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs already mentioned, including the economic and trade and, of course, environment. And of course, to unite the efforts not only on acknowledging the common problems we are facing in Arctic, we also need to work on the common actions. That's why we are supporting the development and for the strengthening the instrument which is called Project Support Instrument of the Arctic Council. And this financial mechanism gives us the opportunity not only discuss together the common threats to the Arctic, but also to act together jointly. And one of the projects just covering the issue on the Russian climate, we came here with a presentation of the achievements on one of the projects in the Arctic, which is intended to use this seed money from the project support instrument to develop the project with one of the biggest Russian oil companies, Gazprom Neft, where using the new technologies will shorten the emissions of black carbon, methane, and CO2 by third in the Arctic.
And,
it means
no, it's impressive, although there is a debate to be had about the degree to which we need to be seeing more fossil fuel exploration in the Arctic period, never mind how it's done and how efficient it's done. So we'll have that debate later in the day. But just one very specific and brief point. The Foreign Minister did refer to Russia's military activities in the Arctic and a ramping up of Russia's military commitment. Why is that happening?
You see, Arctic Council is not covering the military issues.
No, I'm not. But this isn't in the. I'm just asking you. Leave aside the Arctic Council. Why is Russia beefing up its military commitments in the Arctic?
You see, I am director of the Department of International Cooperation of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment of Russian Federation, not of the Defense.
Is that Russian for no comment?
President, yes.
Yeah, okay. We need to, but I thank you, sir. It's very important to hear a Russian contribution. I thank you, sir, and you elucidated some very interesting points there. But we're very quickly going to get two more members of our audience involved, and then we're going to have to quickly change in and out of panels. So this gentleman here at the front, and then the gentleman with the hand up behind him next. Yes, sir.
Michael Byers, University of British Columbia. Actually a follow-up on Russia. A couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer, indicated at a conference that the U.S. Navy is planning a freedom of navigation exercise in the Arctic. That wouldn't be in the Bering Strait because it's recognized as an international strait. So he was either talking about the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route. My guess is that he's not talking about the Northwest Passage because there's still a lot of ice in the Northwest Passage that would be very dangerous to a non-ice strengthened naval vessel. But if he's talking about the Northern Sea Route, then we have a very dangerous proposition. The last time that the United States attempted a freedom of navigation exercise in the Northern Sea Route was 1965, when the US Coast Guard icebreaker, the North Wind, was sent to sail through the Vilchilsky Straits. The Soviet embassy told the United States that they would go all the way, quote, to stop that navigation. And the icebreaker turned around. The question is for Senator Murkowski. Does the United States, and particularly the US Navy, understand the importance to Russia in terms of its national identity, in terms of its sovereignty, of the Northern Sea Route as being under Russian control?
I believe that they do. I believe that they do. As I had understood Secretary Spencer and that announcement, the intent was to go up through the Bering Straits and right in the U.S. Arctic waters in the Chukchi, and not be transiting that Northern Sea route. Now, my information may not be entirely correct. Your information may not be entirely correct on that. But I think that there is a very keen sensitivity, particularly given everything else that is at issue with Russia right now. So as important as it is for the United States, and certainly those within the Department of Defense, to project the strength, the military strength that we have, I don't think that there's any intention to be unduly or unnecessarily provocative, whether it's Northern Sea or Northwest Passage.
Well, I guess we need to keep watching that one very closely, but thanks for the contribution. We'll get one more, and then we're going to have to change in and out our panel. But you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Turkel Peterson from the EU's External Action Service. I just wanted to bring up a point which was raised in an analysis we presented in November in Brussels at the smaller Arctic conference called the Arctic Future Symposium. Sort of that we see three phases in this new Arctic policy since the end of the Cold War. First, a consolidation, the Arctic Council, the creation of these new forums. Then they consolidated themselves in the 2000s. But now we're in a third phase where the Arctic is being mainstreamed. It's coming out in so many forums. And I think the discussion that is very welcome here could even be more extended. You could have Bangladesh here, the Maldives. They are threatened by the rise of seawater. The theme of Smart Arctic is very, very challenging. Can you extract oil and gas more technologically beneficially? Or can you run fish farms without having these diseases and these things? It's a tremendous challenge. But what I thought might be relevant also is to specifically draw attention to the point that you've made, Stephen, several times, that if you drive an SUV in Georgia in the United States, you're a citizen of the Arctic, but you don't know. So how do we bring the Arctic to the general population of the world?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point and question, and we will be dealing with it in panels through the course of the 2 days. But Katri, we're going to say goodbye to you in a minute, so I want you just to have one more thought. Have a thought to that particular point there. You know, the role and the significance of the Arctic actually involves us all, whether we live in the region or not. And how do we make that so very clear to people around the world?
I think it's common sense. As chair of the Norwegian Sami Parliament mentioned, it's for example recycling economy. In a few decades we might not even have word waste. So I'm a true believer of technology, and if we can do those transitions in the most harsh climatic conditions, so it's used for the whole of planet.
Let me ask you a tough question, because you're sitting next to Norway's foreign minister, and Norway is a country deeply committed to a sustainability agenda, but also at the same time deeply committed to exploiting its fossil fuel riches. Now, Finland doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't really have fossil fuel riches, so you can look at your neighbor and friend in Oslo, and you can think, is it really possible to have your cake and eat it? Is it really possible to be a leading nation in terms of sort of pursuing the environmental agenda and the climate responsibility agenda, and yet at the same time insist that it's right to continue to explore new oil and gas fields, to continue to pump out fossil fuels? Is that a credible position to take?
Well, I think I'll leave it to my Norwegian colleagues to debate it on national level. But at the same time,
I want to hear what you think, because Norway sort of has a vested interest in saying, yes, you can have both. But
at the
what does
same
Finland
time,
think?
Norwegian has been extremely innovative and ambitious on transition as well. And at a Nordic level, we've been really ambitious on that stage. So, of course, they've managed to create quite well money out of the oil and gas sector. But still, I have no doubt where the transition is going to be, and it's going to be in somewhere else than fossil fuels.
Away from fossil fuels?
Yes.
And quickly?
Well, we know the EIA thinks for the next 35 years, 20 years, it's going to be still increasing, but Finland, for example, has already made the legislation that we are banning, for example, coal. So I have no doubts that we are getting out of fossil fuel usage.
I think you very elegantly avoided doing what I hoped you would do there, but nonetheless, it's food for thought, and we'll continue to pick away at this theme over the course of the next couple of days. I don't know what you're writing there, Foreign Minister. You're writing, never invite Stephen Sacke to this Arctic frontiers ever again.
No. Make a 5-year contract. That was what I was writing.
No. Anyway, look, we're now going to just do a little bit of reorganization here, because we're squeezing in sort of 2 panel sessions into one. It just means there's a little bit of a personnel change. So as elegantly as I can, I'm going to ask 2 of my panelists to leave the scene, so I can invite 2 more up to fill the chairs. So Yunsun and Stephanie are leaving us at this point. So I thank you both very much for your contributions. We've really appreciated it, and thank you so much. Please give them both a very warm hand.